Hey everyone! Tonight, we're diving into the life of a man who turned the Cold War upside down without ever firing a shot. He lived inside Britain's most secret halls, whispered in Russian safe houses, and carried double identities like second skin. To the West, he was a traitor. To Moscow, a prize. To history, he became something else entirely. George Blake, the spy who fooled MI6 and then broke out of a prison no one had ever escaped. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy peeling back the hidden layers of history. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love watching these stories travel across time zones, reaching people in the quiet hours of their day. Now, lean back. Let the room fall silent. Tonight, we enter the Cold War's hidden corridors, where every phone call could be a trap, every handshake a lie, and one man carried a secret he could never put down. The night air at Wormwood Scrubs carried with it the damp weight of secrecy. The prison loomed like a fortress, its razor wire biting against the night sky, the bricks sweating with years of confinement and whispers. Somewhere beyond those walls, in the shivering shadows, a rope ladder lay discarded, twisted like a dead snake on the cold earth. Guards would later stumble upon it, baffled, their torches probing the void where a prisoner should have been. A man, sentenced to 42 years for betraying his country, had simply vanished. No tunnel, no broken locks, no blood, only the unsettling silence of absence. How does a man under near constant watch, buried in Britain's most notorious prison, simply disappear? The answer is not a story of brute force, but of espionage mechanics as delicate and invisible as spider silk. It is the story of George Blake, a man who lived inside two realities: loyal MI6 officer by day, Soviet mole by night. A man who, long before his escape, had perfected the art of making his very life a mask. Before the rope ladder touched the prison wall, before the gatekeepers ever realized they'd been fooled, Blake had already been running his escape for decades, through dead drops hidden in London parks, through whispers in alleyways, through coded notes passed in plain sight. His prison break was not the beginning of his great deception. It was merely the climax of a double life that had begun the moment he chose betrayal over duty. He had not always been the shadow of a man, split between allegiances. Once, George Blake was a bright, curious boy, the child of a Dutch Protestant mother and a Sephardic Jewish father who had fought for Britain in the First World War. He was raised on stories of valor, of sacrifice, of duty. But duty is a word that bends under pressure, and George Blake's sense of duty would soon be claimed by another flag, another cause, another faith in a system that promised equality but demanded loyalty unto death. It began with war. The Second World War carved Europe into chessboards of loyalty and survival. Blake, then still a young man, found himself in the Netherlands as Nazi boots crushed the cobbled streets. He carried messages for the Dutch resistance, absorbing in those desperate years the mechanics of subterfuge, how to pass unseen, how to hide intent behind casual words, how to take on the quiet endurance of a spy without yet knowing he was becoming one. The resistance taught him that information was a weapon, that truth itself could be smuggled like contraband. By the war's end, those lessons became his passport into MI6. To the British, he seemed the perfect candidate, multilingual, resilient, unafraid. They gave him access, responsibility, and the illusion of trust. He was trained in the art of surveillance, in the ways of cultivating agents, in the cool detachment required to run informants across Europe. But somewhere along the path, something shifted. The Cold War dawned not with gunfire, but with whispers in back rooms. The Iron Curtain fell, and nations divided not just by borders, but by ideologies. To MI6, George Blake was now an officer embedded in this shadow war, but to the KGB, he was an opportunity. Recruitment rarely happened in a smoky backroom filled with Soviet officers. It was slower, subtler, more psychological than physical. For Blake, the seed was planted in the smoldering ruins of post-war Europe, but it took root in Korea. Captured during the Korean War and held prisoner by the North, Blake came into contact with communist captors who spoke not with brutality, but with conviction. They painted a world in which imperialists were the enemy, in which the oppressed could rise, in which loyalty to a cause larger than oneself could wash away guilt. Blake listened. He absorbed. And somewhere in the gray monotony of captivity, he decided that the West had lied, that Britain's empire was nothing but a mask for oppression. He chose his side. When Blake returned from captivity, he was no longer just an MI6 officer. He was also a Soviet agent. He would not raise a pistol against his colleagues. He would not plant bombs or slit throats. His weapon was subtler. Paper, ink, microfilm. Espionage at this level was a matter of mechanics. How to extract secrets without leaving fingerprints. How to pass information without ever being seen in the same place as a handler. Blake mastered the craft. At first, it was simple. Stolen documents photographed with miniature cameras, films hidden in hollowed matchboxes, messages reduced to pin-sized dots on scraps of paper that could be read only through a magnifying glass. These microdots allowed entire files to be shrunk into a letter that could slip unnoticed through censors' hands. When it was too dangerous to meet, Blake would use brush passes, fleeting encounters in public places, designed to look accidental. Imagine a crowded London park, children feeding pigeons, lovers strolling by the fountains. A man sits on a bench, reading a newspaper. Another walks past, dropping his matchbox as though careless. The seated man picks it up, mutters a polite, "You dropped this." And in that instant, intelligence worth lives and reputations changes hands. To onlookers, it is nothing. To the KGB, it is a victory. Blake also relied on dead drops, those timeless staples of espionage where information could be hidden in seemingly mundane places. A hollow tree trunk, a loose brick in a wall, the underside of a park bench. To the casual eye, these were forgotten corners of the city. To Blake and his handlers, they were lifelines. But every transmission, every stolen document, carried the risk of discovery. At any moment, a colleague might notice a file missing. A superior might question his late nights. A surveillance team might follow too closely. The tension of Blake's existence was in the duality. Sipping tea in the MI6 canteen while carrying in his pocket the means to dismantle Britain's intelligence networks. The calm mask of an officer and the pulsing heart of a traitor. The betrayals were staggering. By the time Blake was unmasked, he had revealed the names of hundreds of British agents, compromised entire MI6 networks, and left men and women behind the Iron Curtain to face prison or worse. Some disappeared forever, swallowed by the KGB's ruthless machinery. Yet Blake, outwardly calm and professional, walked the corridors of MI6 each day, greeting colleagues whose lives he had already signed away with a nod, a smile, or a handshake. Paranoia thrives in silence. As whispers of betrayal reached MI6, suspicion curled like smoke in the corners of offices. How had the Soviets known so much? Why were networks collapsing with surgical precision? The answer was never obvious, because Blake was too ordinary, too polite, too invisible. He was the man who held doors open, who remembered birthdays, who spoke gently and never raised his voice. But no cover lasts forever. Betrayal leaves a trail, even if faint. When Blake's treachery was finally uncovered, Britain reacted with fury. The trial was swift, the sentence merciless. 42 years in prison, one of the harshest ever handed to a spy in British history. MI6 officers who had once shared brandy with him now spat his name. Newspapers branded him a traitor, a Judas. In Wormwood Scrubs, George Blake ceased to be an officer, ceased to be an agent. He was a prisoner, sealed away behind high walls and barbed wire. And yet, even as his cell door clanged shut, Blake's mind remained free, ticking like a clock, weighing possibilities. Espionage is, at its core, the art of escape. Escape from detection, from capture, from the inevitability of truth. For Blake, the prison walls were simply another problem to solve, another code to crack. And as Britain congratulated itself on locking him away, Blake was already beginning to weave the invisible threads of his greatest operation, his escape. But how could he? How does a man in one of Britain's most secure prisons communicate with the outside world? How could he signal without radios, without handlers, without the anonymity of crowded parks? Somewhere inside Wormwood Scrubs, the mechanics of espionage were quietly at work again. Coded letters, subtle signals, the repurposing of everyday objects into tools of freedom. The rope ladder on that October night was not the beginning of Blake's escape. It was only the end of a process built on spycraft. His escape had started years earlier, the moment he chose betrayal. The question now was simple, terrifying, and irresistible. If Britain could not keep George Blake locked away, what secrets were truly safe? Night in London always carried a certain heaviness, but for George Blake, the shadows in 1961 seemed to stretch longer than they ever had before. His world had been built on lies woven so tightly into one another that they seemed indistinguishable from truth. Yet in those final days before his capture, he began to sense that someone, somewhere, was pulling at a loose thread. It began with the smallest of signs, barely perceptible but undeniable to a man who had spent years decoding meaning from silence. A stranger lingering too long on a street corner, a car that appeared on Monday and returned again on Thursday, a subtle shift in how colleagues at MI6 addressed him, friendly but with just a shade too much formality, as though rehearsed. To a man who had lived his double life with the constant fear of discovery, paranoia was not a sickness, but a survival instinct, and it whispered now that the game he had played so flawlessly was drawing to its end. MI5 had begun the tightening circle long before Blake himself sensed it. British counterintelligence had learned through bitter experience that catching a double agent required not brute force, but patience and artistry. They did not confront a man like Blake directly. Instead, they built a web around him, invisible yet inescapable. Surveillance detection routes became their art form, the city their canvas. Teams of watchers followed him in overlapping patterns, swapping cars at predetermined points so as not to be noticed. Blake, who had once taught himself to spot the tail of a would-be follower, began to feel something uncanny, moments when footsteps matched too perfectly, when a man he had passed on a bridge seemed also to appear at the cafe on the next street. He knew what these signs meant, but in the secret chambers of his mind, he clung to the faint hope that they were coincidences. Hope, after all, had always been a spy's most dangerous companion. What Blake could not know was that the net had been cast wide and carefully, not only around him, but around the fragments of coded messages that had slipped through the cracks of East and West. Somewhere in the cryptic chatter of KGB ciphers, British analysts had traced a thread that, when pulled, led back to him. The deciphering of such communications was an agonizingly slow process, where single words might yield their secrets only after months of effort. But once a breakthrough came, once a particular cipher key was found, the entire correspondence began to unfold like a confession written by the enemy themselves. Among the intercepted fragments were hints of a source deep inside British intelligence, a man whose knowledge and timing could only belong to Blake. Each decrypted phrase was like a spotlight, narrowing ever more tightly on his shadowed figure. When the hammer finally fell, it did not come in a blaze of confrontation, but with the quiet precision that MI5 preferred. Blake was summoned under a pretext that seemed routine, a familiar enough maneuver that gave him no reason to resist. It was only when he found himself in a room with men whose faces were set in grim determination rather than casual formality that the air shifted, heavy with inevitability. The questions came first as needles, probing at the edges of his defenses, small inconsistencies, peculiar timings, trivial details that seemed too minor to matter. Blake, trained in deception, parried each with a calmness that bordered on arrogance. But the interrogators, masters in their own right, knew that a double agent was not broken by brute accusations, but by the careful manipulation of what he believed to be true. The double agent test was as much psychological warfare as it was interrogation. They fed him fragments of information, some accurate, others carefully falsified, watching for the telltale flickers in his eyes, the microsecond of hesitation before an answer, the sweat at his temple when confronted with something he thought they could not know. The genius of the method was that it turned certainty into doubt. Each time Blake thought he had caught them in a mistake, another piece of evidence appeared that closed the gap. They controlled the tempo, the silences, the pressure. For a man who had long thrived on the manipulation of truth, to feel truth itself being manipulated against him was a torment that cracked even his formidable composure. Yet Blake did not confess easily. He clung to the craft that had defined his existence, calculating every word, weighing the costs of denial against the dangers of admission. Still, the weight of surveillance and ciphers became unbearable proof. They showed him records of meetings he had thought invisible, letters he believed had been safely microfilmed and hidden in Soviet hands, and the testimony of colleagues who had unknowingly provided small pieces of the puzzle that, once assembled, formed a picture that could not be denied. The walls of deception he had built over a decade came tumbling down in that interrogation room, not with a single crushing blow, but with 1,000 small fractures. At last, even Blake recognized that the game had ended. His trial in 1961 was not a spectacle in the sense of flashing cameras and screaming headlines. Rather, it was a quiet, methodical dissection of a man's betrayal. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with both anger and fascination. How had this man, who had been entrusted with the most sacred secrets of the nation, who had moved so seamlessly within the corridors of MI6, sold Britain's defenses to Moscow? Witnesses spoke of his calmness, his apparent loyalty, the utter impossibility of imagining him as a traitor, until the evidence laid bare the truth. The betrayal was too vast to be measured in single acts. It had cost lives, compromised operations, shifted the balance of the Cold War itself. When the sentence was delivered, 42 years of imprisonment, it carried the weight of both justice and vengeance, the longest sentence ever imposed by a British court at the time. Wormwood Scrubs became his new world, a fortress of stone and steel where betrayal echoed in every clang of a closing door. For most men, prison meant the end, a slow erosion of identity until nothing remained but the dull routine of survival. But for Blake, the spy's instinct refused to die. Even as he settled into the monotony of prison life, his mind sharpened itself on the whetstone of possibility. The interrogators had broken his double life, but they had not broken the essence of what he was. A spy does not stop scheming simply because the stage has changed. He adapts, reshapes, and begins again. In the cold corridors of Wormwood Scrubs, he observed and calculated. He studied the guards, their schedules, their habits, the rhythm of their footsteps in the night. He watched his fellow prisoners, testing who could be trusted, who could be manipulated, and who might one day prove useful. He listened for whispers of opportunity, the way he once listened for the click of a brush pass in a London park. Prison to Blake was not confinement, but a new theater of operations, one where survival depended on the same art of deception and patience that had defined his life outside. There were moments in the dead of night when the enormity of what had happened pressed down on him. He had been unmasked, caged, stripped of the illusions he had spun so carefully. And yet, even in those moments of despair, another thought slithered into his mind, persistent and seductive. The game was not over. If he could be recruited once, if he could live 2 lives, then surely he could find a way to bend even this fortress to his will. The walls might cage his body, but they could never fully cage the mind of a man who had once traded nations with nothing more than a glance, a code, a slip of microfilm hidden in a matchbox. And so Blake began to think not like a prisoner, but like a spy once more. He traced invisible escape routes in his head, not yet knowing how they might be made real, but savoring the simple act of imagining. He cultivated allies quietly, not through promises of ideology, but through the subtle manipulation of needs and weaknesses. He transformed despair into fuel, turning the very sentence that was meant to erase him into the crucible in which he would forge his next deception. The world believed George Blake had been caught, broken, and buried behind stone walls for nearly half a century. But within those walls, in the silence between footsteps and the darkness between lights, he was already planning. Not how to endure, not how to repent, but how to disappear again into the shadows. For a spy, prison was not the end. It was simply another stage, another cover, another chance to prove that the game was never truly over. It begins with a sound that most prisoners learn to ignore, a sound that to George Blake was never background noise but signal. The jangling of keys in the corridor, the steady rhythm of boots on concrete, the tiny changes in tone that revealed who the guard was, how tired, how alert, and how predictable. In Wormwood Scrubs, where men were supposed to be broken down into silence and routine, Blake heard patterns, opportunities, vulnerabilities. His cell was not a cage, it was a listening post, and from the moment he crossed the threshold, he understood that the prison itself could be re-engineered into a theater of espionage, with criminals for assets, guards for surveillance subjects, and walls that might one day be penetrated if the right network was built. To survive was never his goal. From the first night, Blake thought only of escape, but not escape through brute force. He would make Wormwood Scrubs into a spy school, and he would graduate by vanishing from it entirely. At first, the guards underestimated him. They saw the small, soft-spoken man with wire-rimmed glasses and assumed intellectual defeat. He played into this, projecting docility, feigning quiet shame. Yet even here his tradecraft was alive. He tested conversations like an intelligence officer, probing a new contact. When fellow inmates spoke of botched robberies or drunken assaults, Blake nodded with sympathetic restraint, as though he were one of them. But when he wanted more, he leaned in and used the techniques he had mastered with MI6 and the KGB alike: flattery, subtle ideological hooks, and the promise that loyalty would be rewarded later. Prisoners who had never thought themselves capable of anything beyond theft suddenly found themselves believing they could be part of something larger, part of a mission. Blake identified the loners first, the men with chips on their shoulders against the system, men who believed they were owed something. With them, he used shared resentment as the lever. With others, hardened career criminals, he spoke with admiration for their nerve and their ability to defy authority. He told them they reminded him of men he had known in the war, daring partisans behind enemy lines. They weren't petty thieves, he suggested. They were wasted soldiers who had never been given a cause worthy of their skills. This was textbook recruitment, not dissimilar from how Moscow had once lured him. Only now he was the handler, not the asset. Soon, he built a circle of confidants, not by announcing an escape, but by planting the thought slowly. In whispered talks in the exercise yard, he compared the rigidity of prison routines to the rigidity of military patrols. He drew analogies between guards and sentries, between locked gates and fortified checkpoints. His companions began to see their jail not as a monolithic system, but as a flawed perimeter, one that a clever mind could exploit. By treating his fellow inmates like operatives, he gave them new eyes, a shift in perspective that made them useful to him. He wasn't promising freedom tomorrow. He was promising them the discipline of espionage, the thrill of belonging to something secret and organized. The tradecraft extended beyond psychology. Blake began mapping the institution in his mind with the discipline of an intelligence officer. Every guard had a rhythm. Some lingered at cell doors to chat. Others marched in silence. Blake memorized not only their movements, but their moods, cataloging the days when fatigue made them sloppy, the hours when their attention drifted. He noticed how one guard favored his left leg, slowing his pace at certain turns. Another checked his watch habitually, giving away his sense of timing. Blake didn't merely observe. He reconstructed their routines into a schedule of vulnerabilities. By the third month, he could predict with unnerving accuracy which officer would pass by and how distracted he would be at that moment. He extended this discipline to the building itself. Like a surveillance officer charting enemy terrain, Blake memorized the sound of distant gates opening and closing, the echo patterns in stairwells, the slight drafts that betrayed concealed vents. He was training himself, but he was also training his circle. He asked his trusted allies to watch for small details, the exact moment the lights flickered in the evening, the second when the guard rotation overlapped by a few minutes, the frequency of deliveries through the service entrances. Each prisoner became an observer, each detail a piece of intelligence fed into Blake's invisible operation. But there remained the problem of communication with the outside world. For an escape to be real, someone beyond the walls had to be primed, and Blake knew that crude letters would never pass censorship. Here, he returned to the mechanics of espionage he had once used in the field. He taught his allies how to use invisible ink made from the most mundane prison material imaginable, their own urine. A message written and dried would appear blank, then later reveal itself under heat. For others, he demonstrated a pinprick system, selecting letters in printed books, pricking them in sequences that spelled hidden instructions. A folded page method carried still more subtlety. A page dog-eared in a particular way could signal whether an operation was on track or whether caution was required. In this manner, letters that seemed like dull correspondence with family became coded transmissions, smuggled out past the very censors meant to silence him. One surviving account recalled how Blake described these methods to an inmate as if he were teaching a game. "You never write what you mean," he said. "You write one message for the eyes that watch, and another for the one who knows where to look." It was the essence of tradecraft. Deception layered over reality, secrecy hidden in plain sight. The effect on the men around him was intoxicating. Ordinary convicts felt themselves transformed into operatives of a secret mission. Every folded corner, every flick of a lighter under a letter became an act of defiance, an assertion of intelligence against authority. Blake gave them purpose, and with purpose came loyalty. He promised them not money, though some dreamed of that, but the thrill of outwitting their captors. For men whose lives had been reduced to repetitive drudgery, this was a revelation. Yet Blake never lost his sense of hierarchy. He was the handler, and they were the assets. He compartmentalized information like a seasoned spy. No one man knew the whole plan. Some only memorized guard schedules. Others learned to write hidden notes. A few were told of potential escape routes, but never of the timing. If one were caught, he would reveal little that could imperil the operation. Blake understood that the prison was alive with ears. Informants were currency inside wormwood scrubs, and one careless word could mean transfer to isolation. He maintained control through measured risk. He tested loyalty in small ways before entrusting anything larger. A man who obeyed the instruction to observe a guard's footsteps without speaking of it afterward could be trusted further. A man who bragged or grew reckless was cut out. In this way, Blake sifted through the population like a case officer, filtering through raw recruits, distilling his team into a cadre of the reliable and the useful. The suspense grew with each passing month. Prison was supposed to be the end of espionage, but under Blake, it became an extension of it, a new frontier where tradecraft adapted to confinement. To the outside world, Wormwood Scrubs was simply a Victorian fortress holding one of Britain's most notorious traitors. Inside, however, it was turning into a clandestine training ground where codes were written with urine, intelligence was gathered from footsteps, and criminals were reshaped into conspirators. What no one in authority yet realized was that Blake's escape, when it came, would not be the result of fortune or outside rescue. It would be the logical conclusion of a system he had already put in motion, the culmination of spycraft transposed into prison life. He was not merely biding his time, he was directing an operation. Every whisper, every folded page, every memorized routine was a brick laid in a tunnel of invisible planning, and the closer it drew, the more apparent it became that this was not a prisoner dreaming of freedom, but an intelligence officer running one of the most dangerous operations of his career inside the very walls meant to contain him. By the time whispers of an escape began circulating, they were not rumors at all. They were proof that Blake's operation had already matured into a living plan, that Wormwood Scrubs was no longer a place of incarceration, but a battlefield of espionage, one in which Blake was not a captive, but the commander. And in that realization lay the seed of suspense that made the impossible seem inevitable. George Blake's prison life was not the end of the story, but the beginning of his most audacious mission, and the walls around him were already starting to crack under the weight of his espionage. The cell was silent, except for the faint scratch of pencil against paper, a sound so ordinary that no guard passing by would give it a second thought. Yet, within those strokes lay the architecture of a prison break that defied reason, a design so improbable it belonged not to the imagination of petty thieves, but to the mind of a man who had lived and breathed espionage for decades. George Blake knew that Wormwood Scrubs was not an iron fortress. It was a puzzle, a system of rhythms and blind spots waiting to be exploited, and he intended to exploit it with the precision of a professional spy. What seemed to others like despair was, to him, merely another assignment. His mission? Extract himself from captivity as though exfiltrating an agent from enemy territory. He began not with walls, but with people. For Blake, the prison staff and inmates were no different from foreign intelligence officers or unwitting informants. Everyone could be studied, their weaknesses catalogued, their habits dissected. The blueprint of his escape was not just an arrangement of bricks, keys, and locks, but an understanding of human nature. He pressed his fellow inmates into service not by demanding, but by insinuating. Around the prison yard, he would casually remark that every fortress had its weak points, and men accustomed to fantasizing about freedom soon leaned closer, hungry for specifics. Blake never declared himself the leader of an escape. He made the idea bloom in their minds until they believed it was theirs. Then, when the fever of hope had been stoked, he carefully offered the structure, the discipline, the method that only he could provide. But a plan this ambitious could not rely on words alone. It required rehearsal, as though they were actors in a play, or agents preparing for deep cover impersonation. Disguise became their first lesson. In the dim corners of the cell block, men mimicked the shuffle of guards' boots, the swing of their keys, the precise cadence of their commands. Blake corrected their tone, reminding them that authority was more in confidence than in words. One inmate, lanky and sharp-eyed, practiced saying, "Move along now," until it rang with the weary detachment of a man bored of his post. Another adjusted his posture to mirror the stiff-backed stride of a warder. Blake, like a director, absorbed every detail from memory, and corrected them with the patience of a spy master drilling agents before deployment. To communicate with allies outside, they needed more than whispers through the prison grapevine. Real intelligence work demanded ingenuity, and Blake had seen how codes could hide in the banal. Food parcels, those small mercies sent by family and friends, became conduits of clandestine information. A fruitcake delivered from beyond the walls might conceal more than raisins. Wrapped deep in its greasy paper lay hand-drawn maps in miniature. Outlines of London streets compressed so small they seemed like nothing more than scribbles to the untrained eye. These scraps of geography were lifelines, guiding Blake's vision beyond the bars to the streets he would one day traverse as a fugitive. And to preserve them from suspicion, the conspirators folded and refolded them until the creases themselves became a code, a pattern only they could interpret. The prison itself had to be surveilled as though it were an enemy compound. Blake knew that escape was not about brute force. It was about time. Every guard's step, every lock's rotation, every clatter of a meal trolley became intelligence to be logged, studied, and used. Prisoners became lookouts in a carefully choreographed routine. One stood by the laundry room, scratching matches into his cell wall each time the night guard passed, a primitive but effective log of patrol intervals. Another timed the lapse with the smolder of a cigarette, each ash falling like the sand of an hourglass. These makeshift stopwatches, crude though they were, gave Blake what he valued most: certainty. Certainty that the guards could not be everywhere at once, that within their vigilance lay moments of blindness. It was in those blind moments, brief as the shadow of a bird across a courtyard, that Blake saw freedom. The yard, long thought by prisoners as a place of monotony and surveillance, became a training ground. He studied the sight lines from the towers, marking where shadows pooled at dusk. Inmates tested the angles, lingering in corners until shouts drove them back, then reporting which paths had drawn notice and which had not. Every rebuke from a guard, every barked order, was not punishment, but confirmation of boundaries. They were charting the prison like cartographers of captivity. Blake took these scraps of data and built them into a rhythm, a sequence of steps that could be danced on the night of escape. Yet, in espionage, every message, every note, carries with it the seed of disaster. One evening, a folded scrap of paper slipped from a man's cuff as he returned to his cell. A guard, sharp-eyed and suspicious, stooped to retrieve it. Blake's breath froze as the man unfolded the page. Within lay what appeared to be nothing more than a child's doodles, lines that crossed and curled with no apparent order. The guard frowned, turning it over in his hand, his eyes narrowing as if searching for meaning. For long seconds that stretched into eternity, Blake imagined the unraveling of everything. The cell searched, the maps discovered, the actors unmasked before the play could begin. But the guard merely snorted, muttered something about lunatics scribbling nonsense, and tossed the page aside. Only after the footsteps receded did Blake allow himself the smallest exhale. He had skirted discovery, not by luck alone, but by the elegance of a code designed to hide in plain sight. The escape was no longer a dream whispered in the dark. It was becoming operational reality. Each man knew his role, each map had been traced, each blind spot tested. Blake was orchestrating not chaos, but order, the same order intelligence officers imposed on the fog of war. And yet, behind the calm, the peril grew sharper. For every practice drill, for every coded letter smuggled, the chance of exposure increased. The closer the plan neared completion, the thinner the line became between brilliance and catastrophe. The prison had become a theater, and Blake its director, but at any moment the curtain could fall with the crash of iron gates, and still he pressed forward, for in his mind there was no alternative. Escape was not simply survival, it was a continuation of duty. To languish in Wormwood scrubs was to betray his masters in Moscow and the life he had chosen. To walk free, however perilous the path, was to remain an operative, to remain George Blake, the man who had deceived Britain's intelligence service and would now deceive its prison walls. The blueprint of escape was etched not only on paper and maps, but into the pulse of every conspirator he had drawn into his orbit. What awaited was execution, the night when practice would turn to peril and peril to freedom. But between him and that night stood the most dangerous adversary of all, time itself, measured not in days or weeks, but in the shifting eyes of the guards and the fragile loyalty of the men he led. The prison held its breath, as though sensing that within its walls a secret war was unfolding, invisible to those who believed themselves in control. George Blake's greatest deception was yet to come, and the blueprints of escape now demanded one final leap from theory into action. Would the walls hold him, or would espionage triumph once more against the machinery of the state? The answer lay just beyond the next locked door, waiting to be tested. It began with silence, a silence so deep that it seemed to press against the stone walls of Wormwood Scrubs like a living thing. Every prisoner knew that silence could be a weapon, a cover for whispers, for movements, for plans that had no right to exist. But on this night in 1966, that silence was electric, charged with the pulse of a man who had already betrayed a nation, who now intended to betray the prison that had tried to cage him. George Blake was not meant to walk free again. The sentence against him was a lifetime broken into pieces, stacked into a mound of years so heavy that it should have crushed any thought of liberty. But Blake had studied the mechanics of deception too long, had lived among shadows too intimately, to believe that cages were unbreakable. Tonight, silence was his cloak, and behind it, every sound, every creak, every scrape, every whisper of rope on stone, became a trigger that might snap the plan in two. For weeks he had rehearsed this moment in the secrecy of his mind. Not aloud, never aloud, because even the air inside Wormwood seemed to have ears, but in the private chambers of memory where every angle, every shadow, every timing was recalculated. The rope that would carry him down from prison walls was not a rope in its original life. It had been smuggled inside, piece by piece, hidden in the hollow legs of furniture brought in under the guise of routine prison replacements, never inspected because monotony was the guard's greatest weakness. Each strand was stitched together by hands calloused from factory work and survival, men who had lived outside the law long before Blake had been branded a traitor. They were his cutouts, his intermediaries, men who would risk themselves without ever sharing a direct word with him. That was the essence of spycraft. Distance preserved deniability. Separation created safety. He knew none of them personally, and that was exactly how it had to be. At the center of this operation lay a signal so simple that it would be invisible to anyone who wasn't searching for it. From across the street, in a nondescript flat that looked no different from the others, a single flash of light would pierce the night air. Not too long, not too short, but exact, the product of rehearsals and testing. A flash that would mean the yard was clear, the patrols were in rhythm, and no extra eyes lingered at the wrong time. For Blake, the anticipation of that signal was more excruciating than any interrogation he had endured in his life. It was the silence before the trigger was pulled, the stillness before the fall. The prison itself, a maze of blind corners and watchful towers, had been studied with the precision of a battlefield map. Blake and the men who aided him had spent nights observing the rhythm of the guards, their footsteps pacing out predictable loops across the grounds. A cigarette stub burned to ash had served as their stopwatch. The length of time it took for one patrol to vanish into shadow and another to emerge had been calculated, adjusted, tested again. The mechanics of espionage had become the mechanics of survival, and now they merged into the mechanics of escape. But none of this meant the execution would be easy. Each second tonight would stretch into an eternity, and every small sound would echo louder than thunder. As Blake approached the appointed window, hidden in the depths of his cell block, he felt the strange calm that often fell over him in the most dangerous of moments, a calm that had steadied him when slipping coded films through diplomatic bags, when walking past men who would have killed him if they had known who he truly served. Yet this calm was pierced by the knowledge that here there would be no diplomatic immunity, no clever argument, no embassy walls to shield him if he failed. At last, through the thin slit of vision that separated the prison from the world beyond, the flash came. It was so brief that a guard glancing idly at the street might have mistaken it for nothing more than a reflection, a passing car headlight. But Blake knew it as the voice of freedom, speaking without words. All clear. It was time. The rope ladder was drawn out, section by section, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. The fabric rasped faintly as it unfolded, and for a moment, Blake was certain that every guard within 50 yards must have heard it. He held his breath, listening for footsteps, the bark of an order, the metallic jingle of keys. Nothing. Only the sound of his own pulse hammering inside his ears. He secured the first hook, its jagged metal teeth sinking into the stone edge of the wall. He tugged once, twice, 3 times. It held. Still, he hesitated, staring into the darkness below, where the yard spread like an ocean of uncertainty. One wrong move, one stumble, one guard's eyes catching the faintest sway of rope in the night air, and all would be over. He began his descent. Each step was a negotiation between balance and silence. The rope groaned faintly against the stone, a whisper of protest that seemed deafening in the hush of the prison yard. Blake froze, his hands clenching until his knuckles whitened, straining to hear whether that whisper had drawn attention. Again, silence. He moved on, inch by inch, down the cold, unyielding wall. Shadows shifted beneath him as patrols passed, their beams of light slicing across the ground. He clung motionless, pressed against stone, feeling like his very breath might betray him. One shadow paused, lingered, then moved on. Blake exhaled only when the darkness swallowed it again. The ground came closer, the rope trembling with the weight of both his body and his fate. When his boots finally touched the earth, he did not release his grip immediately. He crouched, listening. Above him, the prison loomed like a sleeping giant, indifferent, yet deadly. He darted into the narrow strip of shadow that lay between the wall and the blind spot they had measured again and again. Each second he remained was borrowed time. Across the yard, a figure moved, a shadow too large, too sharp. Blake froze. The guard paused, shifted his beam of light, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to collapse into that single moment. Would the glint of rope above betray the presence of a man who should never be here? Would the shifting of shadow on stone reveal him? The beam lingered, then slid away, chasing an imagined noise into the opposite corner. Blake's breath came back ragged, his chest tight with the weight of a reprieve. He moved again, timing each dash to the cigarette burn of seconds in his mind. The gate was ahead, and with it, the most dangerous threshold of all. There, beyond the iron teeth of the prison perimeter, waited a cutout he had never met, a man whose face was unknown to him. That was the rule. One never touched the source directly. One never named the names. He was stepping not into the arms of friends, but into the machinery of clandestine loyalty. The final signal was a whisper of motion, a cough practiced and delivered at the exact pitch that meant the car was waiting. Blake reached the agreed spot, his heart pounding so violently he feared it would betray him. The sound of an engine, idling low, drifted through the night air. Then, from the shadow of an alley, a hand pulled him forward, quick, firm, leaving no chance for hesitation. The rope behind him still swayed gently, a phantom of the man who had used it. In the yard above, guards continued their routines, unaware that history had just slipped through their fingers. Within moments, Blake was inside the car, its doors closing him into a cocoon of escape. The engine shifted from idle to motion, and the prison began to recede behind him, shrinking with every turn of the wheel. He had vanished from Wormwood Scrubs, a man who was never meant to vanish. But in the secrecy of that car, as the city lights bled into the horizon, another question began to sharpen like a knife. Where could he possibly go now? Freedom was not the end of danger. For George Blake, it was only the beginning. London should have been the safest place in the world to disappear. Yet, for George Blake, every creak of a stair, every sudden knock at a door, every flicker of headlights on a rain-slick street felt like the echo of pursuit. He had escaped the walls of Wormwood Scrubs, yes, but in truth, the prison had only changed shape. Now, the city itself became his cage, a sprawling labyrinth where survival depended not on iron bars, but on shadows, silences, and the delicate choreography of deception. The moment he vanished into that waiting car outside the prison yard, the clock began ticking on his second life. One lived not in freedom, but in the suffocating embrace of fugitive existence. And in that narrow space between capture and deliverance, Blake would deploy the mechanics of espionage that had once been theoretical training, now transformed into his sole means of survival. The safe houses were never glamorous. Forget the cinematic hideouts with polished escape routes and furnished dens of conspiracy. His sanctuaries were peeling flats above shuttered shops, damp cellars where mildew clung to the air, back rooms of sympathetic radicals who mistrusted authority more than they feared harboring a fugitive. These places were anonymous by design, indistinguishable from the countless weary dwellings scattered through London's working-class neighborhoods. Blake learned to move silently within them, never staying longer than a few nights, never leaving behind a trace of his presence. The sheets remained unwashed, the bins empty, the windows covered so no silhouette betrayed him to a patrolling constable outside. Every place was temporary, every door a potential trap. Yet it was within these bare rooms that he rehearsed the performance that would keep him alive. False identities were his new armor, crafted not from documents alone, but from posture, tone, and the mundane banalities of ordinary life. He practiced standing in front of a cracked mirror, rehearsing how to answer the casual inquiries of a neighbor who might notice a stranger in the stairwell. He built cover stories as though they were stage plays: a visiting cousin from the Midlands, a lodger looking for work, a pensioner's son dropping by with groceries. Each lie had to be rehearsed until it rolled off his tongue with the natural ease of truth. His accomplices coached him, drilling him in the art of ordinariness, reminding him that the most effective disguise was not a false mustache or a forged passport, but the forgettable face in the crowd. Blake, who had once navigated the secret corridors of embassies and intelligence services, now reduced his tradecraft to the art of blending in with the anonymity of London's teeming millions. Communication was his greatest danger, for in the act of reaching out lay the highest risk of exposure. Here the mechanics of espionage became both lifeline and razor edge. Dead drops were arranged in the city's parks, a hollow tree stump in Hampstead Heath, a rusted tin beneath a park bench in Clissold, a folded newspaper left beside a war memorial. Messages were short, coded, and precise, always written with the knowledge that discovery meant unraveling the entire chain of escape. A matchbox with a red mark might mean it was safe to move. A book of bus tickets might signal that watchers were near. These exchanges, invisible to passers-by walking their dogs or children playing nearby, formed the secret pulse of Blake's life on the run, a clandestine heartbeat keeping him alive from one day to the next. Yet, outside these careful rituals, the manhunt was tightening. MI5, blindsided by his disappearance, at first treated rumors with disbelief. How could one of Britain's most notorious spies simply vanish from a high-security prison? But when reality could no longer be denied, the full machinery of surveillance and counterintelligence ground into motion. Blake's name was whispered in briefing rooms, his face pinned to walls of incident boards. Every known associate was trailed, every sympathizer interrogated, every whisper of dissent on the streets filtered for a trace of his whereabouts. Chatter emerged, fragments overheard in pubs or gathered through informants. Talk of radicals helping an escaped convict, rumors of coded messages passed hand to hand. But London was too vast, too dense, and Blake too skilled in the mechanics of disappearance. The suspense lay in the cracks of uncertainty. A patrol car might slow as it passed one of his hideouts, its headlights grazing the curtains. Was it random or deliberate? A knock at the door might come too late at night, the footsteps outside lingering before retreating. Was it a landlord or the echo of surveillance closing in? Each moment was lived on the edge, the air thick with the possibility that discovery was only seconds away. And Blake himself, who had once carried the calm arrogance of a seasoned agent, now began to feel the weight of paranoia. He questioned every sound, every glance, every movement of the strangers around him. Yet that paranoia sharpened his instincts, kept him alive, reminded him that to relax even for a heartbeat was to invite capture. Still, beneath the terror lay a kind of grim exhilaration. For Blake, espionage was no longer an abstract service to ideology or state. It had become survival itself. Every safe house entered, every false word spoken, every message dropped into the hidden veins of London was part of the game he had studied all his life. And in that game, there were no second chances. The city around him bustled with ordinary life, commuters rushing to trains, markets clattering with vendors, children chasing one another in playgrounds. Yet Blake existed in an underworld threaded invisibly through the same streets. His London was a city of signals and shadows, of coded gestures and unseen watchers, where survival meant moving always just beyond the reach of those hunting him. But the walls of the city were closing. MI5 might not yet have found him, but their net was tightening. Informants whispered, surveillance teams prowled, and somewhere deep within the intelligence files lay the first hints that the escape was more than luck, that a network of sympathizers was shielding him. The question was not whether Blake could survive another night, but how much longer London could conceal him. And with each day, the inevitability of flight grew stronger. For if the city was no longer safe, then the game would have to expand into the wider world, into foreign hands, into the waiting arms of those who had once trained him to deceive. The path toward Moscow was not yet visible, but its shadow had already begun to stretch across the narrow rooms and secret parks where Blake fought for breath, waiting for the signal that would carry him beyond the reach of Britain's hunters. Would MI5's tightening circle close in before that path revealed itself? Or would Blake vanish once again into the unseen currents of the Cold War? That question haunted both sides of the hunt, and in the answer lay the next act of his dangerous flight. The night in London had already grown colder when George Blake understood that the small flats, the parks, and the dead letter boxes would not be enough to keep him safe forever. He had become a shadow in the city, a man hidden in the folds of sympathizers' lives, but shadows in London could not survive indefinitely, not with MI5 turning over every stone. The murmur of the underground network whispered the same refrain in his ears. It was time to move, time to vanish beyond the reach of British police, beyond the island itself. Moscow was the sanctuary waiting for him, but the road to Moscow was no straight line. It would be paved with false papers, code words, shifting disguises, and moments when his pulse would quicken at the sight of a uniformed guard lingering too long over a single sheet of paper. The plan that carried him out of Britain was not a single daring dash, but a choreography of espionage mechanics assembled with meticulous patience. Soviet bloc forgers in East Berlin had already prepared his passports, multiple nationalities, each with the weathered look of authenticity. These were not pristine documents, as real passports never were. The edges were softened, the pages carried the scuffs of travel, the ink stamps of plausible journeys, the faint smudges of fingers that had supposedly thumbed through them over time. Blake studied each identity in dimly lit rooms, committing to memory the invented histories attached to them. He whispered the names under his breath, as if trying to convince his own mind that he had truly been these men. A Dutch businessman on one passport, a Canadian student on another, a Belgian lorry driver on the third. He repeated the details until they became reflex, until, when asked, he would not hesitate to say the name of a fictional mother or the address of a non-existent apartment in Antwerp. The rehearsals of cover stories were not idle recitations. They were drills in survival. To carry a false passport was one thing, but to live the skin of its owner required precision. Blake practiced accents, slipping Dutch inflections into his English, then trying again with a neutral Canadian tone that downplayed European traces. He studied maps of roads he had never walked, memorized train timetables from cities he had never visited, until the geography of his false life was as familiar to him as his true one. At times, he would ask himself questions aloud in the mirror, just as an interrogating border guard might, answering with feigned irritation, casual dismissal, or weary humor, depending on which mask he wore that day. The mechanics of deception had become his second heartbeat. To link him across the shifting borders of Western Europe required another layer of spycraft, one less visible but equally dangerous: cutout couriers. They were the lifelines who ferried his documents, his coded instructions, and sometimes even scraps of reassurance from the Soviet side. These couriers were chosen carefully for their inconspicuousness. Neutral country students traveling for their studies, long-haul truck drivers hauling cargo across frontiers, even a wandering cleric with access to routes few would question. None of them knew Blake directly, and that was the point. They carried envelopes or folded sheets concealed in false-bottom suitcases or in the seams of coats, never aware of the full chain into which they fit. Blake never met them face to face. He received their work as if the city itself had delivered it. A folded page waiting in a bookshop, a packet of documents slipped inside a hollowed cigarette tin left beneath a park bench, or a bundle handed to him by a stranger who never spoke a word and walked away without looking back. Every transition from one safe zone to the next involved border-crossing tradecraft, and Blake knew that these would be the moments where the entire structure of the operation could collapse. The art of the crossing lay not in the brilliance of the forged document, but in the manner it was presented. A passport, no matter how perfect, could betray its carrier if his hands trembled when he placed it on the counter, or if his gaze faltered under the scrutiny of a guard. Blake practiced the small gestures of authenticity, fumbling with change as though distracted, muttering about the lateness of a train, yawning to feign the exhaustion of a long journey. He carried the air of ordinariness like a cloak, reminding himself that the safest way through was to appear so forgettable that no one's memory could retain him even minutes later. As he moved across Europe, his journey seemed both fluid and perilous. The anonymity of trains, buses, and crowded stations gave him cover, yet each transfer pressed the tension deeper into his chest. In the haze of cigarette smoke and clattering wheels, he became adept at reading the rhythm of guards' inspections. Some leafed through passports with lazy disinterest, others flipped each page with a hunter's suspicion. At one crossing, the air itself seemed to tighten when a uniformed man paused too long over his papers. The seconds stretched into unbearable silence, the shuffle of boots in the line behind him growing louder with every heartbeat. The guard traced a finger across the stamp, his brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. Blake's mind rehearsed the contingency plans: denial, diversion, a story of confusion, perhaps even an attempt to bolt. His palms sweated, yet outwardly he forced himself into the performance of a weary traveler, shifting weight from one foot to another, exhaling with impatience. The guard glanced up, eyes narrowing, then looked back at the paper. Another moment passed. Blake thought it was the end, but then, with a flick of the wrist, the document was handed back. A dismissive gesture waved him through, and Blake walked away with measured calm, every muscle resisting the urge to flee. Behind each crossing lay a new territory of uncertainty. Safe houses were arranged in European cities where sympathizers, many with histories of student protest and anti-establishment leanings, offered beds and food. These were not permanent sanctuaries, but staging grounds chosen for their obscurity rather than comfort. A cramped attic in Brussels, a cellar in Cologne, a dingy backroom above a bar in Paris, each became part of the geography of his passage. In these spaces, Blake rehearsed the next mask he would wear, sometimes whispering cover stories in the dark, other times crouched by a radio, listening for coded signals buried within ordinary broadcasts. The couriers arrived silently, slipping in and out like phantoms, their brief exchanges leaving behind only the tools he needed for the next leap forward. And yet, the more he advanced, the closer the risk grew. MI5 was not blind to the possibility of his escape eastward. Intercepts of chatter hinted at couriers and at whispers of forged papers moving across the continent. British and Allied intelligence quietly coordinated with border services, tightening scrutiny, spreading descriptions of a man who might be traveling under a false name. Blake knew he was being hunted not only in the alleys of London, but now across the very routes he traveled. Every checkpoint was a battlefield of nerves, every handshake with a courier, an act of faith that the chain had not been compromised. The long road east became a slow duel of patience and deception. Blake carried with him the weight of his choices, the understanding that one mistake, one slip of tone, one inconsistency in his story could collapse everything. Yet, the promise of Moscow kept him pressing forward through the smoke-filled compartments of trains, the rain-slick streets of foreign cities, the narrow alleys where shadows hid both allies and enemies. The danger was never abstract. It lived in the eyes of every guard who looked at him, in the silence of every room where he rehearsed his lies, in the coded weight of every document he carried in the lining of his coat. And then, on a border where the night was heavy with fog and suspicion, he faced the moment that crystallized the peril of his journey. A guard, unsmiling and deliberate, held his forged passport longer than expected. The paper trembled faintly in the officer's hands as he studied it under the dim light. Blake's chest tightened, his pulse a hammer in his ears. The stillness seemed to stretch into eternity. The guard's lips moved slightly, as though preparing to speak, perhaps to call over a superior, perhaps to ask a question whose answer could unravel everything. Blake's thoughts sharpened into a single clarity. This might be the end, the point where the long road east collapsed into arrest and exposure. But then came the flicker of indifference, the shift from suspicion to routine. The guard pushed the papers back, muttered something inaudible, and with a half-wave allowed him through. Blake walked forward without breaking stride, his body heavy with relief he dared not show, his mind whispering the same thought again and again. Moscow was still ahead. The road had not closed. It was only after the guard's eyes lingered on the forged passport for what felt like an eternity that the air around Blake seemed to thicken into silence, a silence so sharp it could have cut through glass, the kind that made his heartbeat sound like a drum in his ears. He knew in that moment that if the guard lifted his gaze and saw the faint glimmer of fear behind his carefully blank mask, The journey would end right there at the border with steel cuffs on his wrists and a return to the very prison walls he had only just escaped. But then, with a shrug that felt almost casual, the guard stamped the page, pushed it back across the desk, and waved him through, as though dismissing a phantom he had only half noticed. Blake did not allow himself even the faintest exhale until he had stepped past the barrier, but in that instant, he realized he was on the cusp of crossing a line not only of geography, but of life itself. Every step now was one step farther away from the England he had known, one step deeper into the embrace of the East, into a Moscow that had long been the whispered promise of his handlers. Yet, the relief was temporary. He knew enough of espionage to recognize that survival was rarely granted in long, uninterrupted stretches. It came in slivers, in moments bought by chance, and those moments could turn against him as quickly as they appeared. As he moved across the border into East Germany, the first real breath of safety mingled with the cold reality of what lay ahead. This was not yet Moscow, not yet the final sanctuary. It was a halfway world, a territory riddled with checkpoints, patrolled by soldiers who understood perfectly the value of a Western fugitive, and controlled by a regime whose trust he still had to earn. The forged papers tucked into his jacket felt heavy, almost radioactive. Each one a carefully crafted lie that had passed beneath the scrutiny of men trained to catch even the smallest tremor in a voice or irregularity in an accent. He clutched them like talismans, knowing they could save him one day and betray him the next. The Soviets had made arrangements for his arrival, though arrangements in this world always carried layers of uncertainty. A courier, someone he would not know by name and would not see again, was supposed to meet him at a designated cafe in Leipzig. The meeting point had been described in coded terms weeks earlier, a place where the chairs outside leaned slightly unevenly, where the awning bore a tier stitched clumsily with gray thread, and where, at noon, a man would be sitting with a folded newspaper that bore a conspicuous crease across its front page. Blake had replayed the description in his mind as though reciting a prayer, because there would be no second attempt, no clarification if he walked into the wrong establishment. The wrong cafe might mean arrest, or worse, the suspicion of betrayal. The train carried him into Leipzig with the slow, methodical rhythm of iron wheels on rails, each jolt reminding him that he was moving farther from one world into another. He disembarked with the composure of someone who had rehearsed his cover story to exhaustion. A Dutch merchant returning from a buying trip, papers in order, accent studied, background memorized. He moved through the station with the practiced ease of anonymity, blending into the flow of travelers, not walking too fast or too slow, carrying nothing that might draw the eye of a curious officer. Every second he rehearsed in silence the answers he would give if challenged. Where was he coming from? Holland. What goods had he purchased? Textiles. How long would he stay? 3 weeks. The answers slid over his tongue like water, smooth, unhesitant, rehearsed until they felt like lived truth. The cafe was there exactly as it had been described, tucked against the curve of a narrow street. He saw the uneven chairs, the stitched awning, and, most importantly, the folded newspaper across the front page. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself the faintest flicker of recognition, though even that he buried beneath a face carefully blank of emotion. He sat at a nearby table, ordered coffee with a tone of mild disinterest, and waited. The man with the newspaper did not look at him, did not acknowledge him. He simply rose, placed a single sugar packet on the edge of Blake's table as though by accident, and walked away. The packet was the signal. Inside, wrapped tightly in wax paper, was a sliver of paper with instructions, a safe house address, a time, and a reminder written in Cyrillic that trust was not yet earned, that surveillance would be watching him as closely as any British agent had before. That night, Blake entered the safe house, a narrow flat on the second floor of a nondescript building whose facade had peeled and faded under decades of soot. Inside, the curtains were drawn, the air stale with the scent of boiled cabbage and damp walls. Two men were waiting, neither introduced by name. One spoke German, the other Russian, and both asked questions with the patience of interrogators. They wanted his recollection of the escape, the methods of his helpers, the timing of his movements, not because they doubted him, but because verification was their shield. For the Soviets, loyalty was never assumed. It was dissected, tested, confirmed through consistency of detail and the absence of hesitation. Blake answered with precision, repeating his story without variance, knowing that even the smallest contradiction could open the door to suspicion. Days passed in this liminal space, the safe house his cage and his sanctuary. He could not leave except at designated hours, and even then only under escort, moving through alleys and side streets as though his very existence had to be filtered through shadows. Yet, with each day came small tokens of progress. Another forged passport handed to him, this one under a new identity, a whispered assurance that preparations were advancing, and finally, the news he had been waiting for, that the next stage would take him closer to Moscow. But the road east was neither straight nor certain. He was to be moved through a series of transfers, each one designed to conceal his trail, not just from Western intelligence, but from those within the Soviet bloc who might wonder too loudly why a British defector was being given safe passage. For this, the mechanics of espionage unfolded like an elaborate play. Couriers carried coded slips of paper in hollowed matchboxes, truck drivers smuggled messages beneath floorboards of their cargo, and neutral country students passed innocuous postcards that in fact contained the signals dictating when and where Blake would move next. He was cargo, human contraband, shuttled along lines of secrecy where every participant was a cutout, designed so that no one person could ever betray the whole chain. The most harrowing moments came not in the safe houses, but at the borders, where his forged passports were tested against the instincts of guards who had been trained to catch hesitation. One such crossing brought him face to face with a guard whose eyes seemed to pierce through the flimsy lamination of his papers and into the marrow of his soul. The man flipped through the passport slowly, too slowly, his thumb dragging across the pages as though savoring the anticipation of catching a lie. Blake's heart beat so violently he feared it would betray him through the tremor of his hands. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. The guard looked up, studied his face for a moment longer, then, with a grunt, stamped the passport and handed it back. Blake muttered a word of thanks in careful, accented German and walked away with steps that betrayed nothing of the storm inside him. Only when he was far enough from the barrier did he allow his breath to escape, shallow, ragged, yet still a breath of survival. It was in East Berlin, finally, that the machinery of secrecy began to turn in his favor. Here, Soviet handlers welcomed him more openly, though even this welcome carried the steel edge of watchfulness. He was debriefed again, asked to account for every name he had known in British intelligence, every fragment of knowledge still locked inside his memory. They spoke to him not as a guest, but as an asset, valuable yet replaceable, a man whose life was entwined with theirs only as long as he remained useful. Blake understood this well. To the Soviets, loyalty was measured not in words, but in utility, and so he offered everything he had, piece by piece, the secrets of the West laid bare in exchange for the sanctuary of the East. The train that finally carried him deeper into the Soviet sphere rolled across the German landscape under a night sky thick with stars. He sat by the window, the hum of the engine steady, the rhythm of the rails a lullaby of progress. Yet his mind did not rest. He thought of London, of the life left behind, of the faces that would never see him again except in photographs stamped with the word traitor. He thought of the cell he had escaped, of the narrow corridor of chance that had brought him here, and of the uncertain future awaiting him in Moscow. Every mile eastward was a mile farther from the gallows that might have claimed him, but also a mile deeper into the embrace of a system that demanded his entire soul. And as the border of the Soviet Union loomed closer, as the air itself seemed to change, heavy with the weight of the Iron Curtain, George Blake felt the shift. The chase was not over. It was merely beginning anew, in a world where trust was as scarce as sunlight, and survival would once again depend on the invisible threads of espionage tradecraft that had carried him this far. Moscow awaited, but Moscow was not the end. It was the beginning of another labyrinth, one that promised both protection and peril in equal measure. The wheels clattered over the tracks, and the gray dawn of a Moscow winter pressed against the train window, and for the first time in years, George Blake felt a sensation he had almost forgotten. Arrival. Not escape, not flight, not disguise or deception, but something heavier, something final. The sense of stepping over an invisible line from which there would be no return. As the carriage slowed and the iron skeleton of the Moscow rail station emerged through the glass, the thought struck him with full force. He had come home to the capital of the very system for which he had betrayed his country, the city that had been the unseen partner in every secret note, every coded message, every name whispered under his breath in prison. He was not crossing a border now. He was entering the embrace of the machine he had served, and he did not know if that embrace would be warm or suffocating. He rose slowly, carrying himself with the composure of a man who knew too well that appearances were always his first line of defense. The false passport in his pocket was still damp from the sweat of border crossings, but here, in the shadow of Lenin City, it was no longer a tool of survival. In Moscow, it was the past, not the present, that would define him. The station air hit his face, raw and metallic, and he walked forward into a crowd of strangers who were not strangers at all. Somewhere among them, he knew, were watchers. Not British, not Western, but Soviet eyes trained to measure the sincerity of his every step. The Soviets did not merely welcome defectors, they dissected them. They took them apart to ensure there was no rot within, no deception hidden beneath the layers of loyalty. For Blake, the question was not whether he had earned his place. It was whether they still wanted him alive. A man approached, his face expressionless, his coat of anonymous cut. He spoke Blake's assumed name with the precision of someone testing the edge of a blade. Blake responded calmly, knowing the ritual, the unspoken dance of verification that every agent underwent when passing into Soviet territory. A phrase, an answer, a gesture. Each was weighed and filed away. At the final nod, Blake was led out of the station into a waiting car. The drive into Moscow was silent, the city unfurling in stern rows of concrete and steel, its monuments towering like sentinels. For Blake, the silence was a test. Every second without speech invited paranoia. Were they already doubting him? Already calculating whether his usefulness had expired? At last, the car slid into a gated compound. The heavy doors closed, and Blake was ushered inside. The room was austere, its warmth entirely functional, its lights unforgiving. He was seated, and then they came, men of the KGB, their presence heavy with authority, their questions carefully calibrated. They did not begin with welcomes or congratulations. They began with interrogation. His journey, the escape, the prison years, the network of helpers, it all had to be recounted in precise detail. They pressed for names, for routes, for timings, not because they did not already know much of it, but because they needed to test his memory, his consistency, his discipline under pressure. The KGB trusted nothing until it had been tested thrice. Blake answered with the calm precision of a man who had rehearsed this in his mind for years. He spoke with neither pride nor defensiveness, only clarity, weaving the narrative as if it were another coded report. At one point, an officer leaned forward and asked, almost casually, whether Blake had ever considered turning double again, whether in prison he had toyed with the idea of betraying Moscow in exchange for freedom. The question was a knife, sudden and sharp. Blake did not flinch. He looked the man in the eye and replied that the thought had never crossed his mind, that prison had not broken him, but confirmed him. The officer said nothing, merely nodded, as though another box had been ticked on a silent ledger. Yet Blake knew the weight of that exchange. In that moment, the entire future of his life in Moscow may have hung in the balance. The days that followed blurred into a process both reassuring and unnerving. He was given an apartment, modest but warm, a space that was his yet not entirely his, for Blake understood that walls in Moscow had ears more sensitive than in Wormwood scrubs. His apartment was both sanctuary and cage, furnished with the necessities of comfort but devoid of excess. Books lined the shelves, curated, certainly, by someone who understood both his past and the life they intended for him. A small desk, a typewriter, a chair by the window. Everything suggested reflection, containment, the life of an exile folded into the state's protection. But there was also the embrace, subtle yet unmistakable. He was visited not just by handlers, but by those who came to make him feel wanted. Professors, cultural figures, comrades in ideology, who reminded him that he was not merely a fugitive, but a soldier in a larger cause. They spoke to him of struggle, of history, of the West's inevitable decline. They told him he was safe now, that he had crossed into the arms of a power that never abandoned its own. Yet, beneath the warmth, Blake always sensed the calculation. Every conversation was a test, every word he spoke a piece of evidence in the file that would decide whether he was truly embraced or merely tolerated. And still, the city drew him in. Moscow was vast, oppressive, yet alive with the pulse of a system that had outlasted purges, famines, and wars. Walking its streets, Blake felt both invisible and exposed. He knew he was being followed, watched, catalogued. He also knew this was the price of survival. The Soviets were not sentimental. They rewarded loyalty with protection, but they demanded submission in return. Blake gave it willingly, for he had nowhere else to go. Britain was closed to him forever. The West had branded him traitor. In Moscow, at least, he was a traitor with a cause. One evening, he was summoned to a secure office where a senior official awaited him. The man spoke slowly, with the authority of someone who did not need to raise his voice. He told Blake that Moscow recognized his service, that his years in prison had not diminished the value of what he had given, that he would be taken care of. But then came the undertone, the subtle reminder. Loyalty was not a thing of the past, it was a currency of the present. He would be expected to write, to share his thoughts on the West, to contribute still to the struggle. Blake listened, nodded, and accepted. It was not unexpected. To serve was to live. To retire was to risk irrelevance, and irrelevance in Moscow could be fatal. As weeks turned to months, Blake's life settled into its strange rhythm. He studied Russian more deeply, attended lectures, read the approved press with both interest and skepticism. He was given opportunities to travel within the Soviet Union, always under escort, always with the reminder that his freedom was conditional. Yet, he found in the vastness of the country a kind of grim solace. Here was a world that had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. The contradictions of his life, the Dutch boy turned British officer turned Soviet spy, seemed to dissolve in the snow-bound streets of Moscow, where ideology mattered more than origin, and survival was the highest proof of conviction. Still, the tests never ceased. subtle provocations, small deceptions. Deliberate misinformation fed to him to see if he repeated it carelessly. Blake understood the game and played it well, answering only what he knew to be certain, never indulging speculation, never rushing to prove his loyalty with reckless words. He had lived too long in shadows to stumble now in the light, and so, slowly, the embrace tightened. He was given a pension, recognition, even respect within the hidden corridors of the state. His name was spoken as one who had endured, who had sacrificed, who had remained true to the cause when lesser men had broken. To the West, he was a traitor. To Moscow, he was an asset vindicated by endurance. Yet Blake knew better than to confuse recognition with trust. He lived always with the awareness that the city that had welcomed him could, in an instant, consume him. The winter thawed into spring, and with it came the realization that he had truly crossed over. There was no going back, no second life in another land, no quiet retirement in obscurity. His fate was bound now to the fortunes of the very state whose cold embrace had become his refuge. Whether it was life or death, triumph or ruin, Moscow was his final stage, and as he looked out over the city one night, its lights spread like constellations beneath the darkness, he felt the paradox press upon him with its full weight. He had escaped a prison only to step into another, one without bars, one defined not by stone walls, but by ideology and watchful eyes. Yet in this prison, he was not a number, not a forgotten captive. He was George Blake, spy of Moscow, traitor of Britain, a man whose very existence was both victory and cautionary tale. It was in that realization, suspended between gratitude and dread, that the story of George Blake in Moscow truly began. A story not of escape, but of entanglement, not of freedom, but of survival inside the embrace of the very empire for which he had gambled everything. He stepped off the train into Moscow as though walking into another skin, a man who had vanished in one country and reappeared in another, leaving behind only questions and whispers. Yet, in that moment of supposed triumph, when George Blake breathed in the thick metallic air of the Soviet capital, the true test of his double life began. For the thrill of escape was fleeting, the embrace of Moscow both welcoming and suffocating, a paradox he would live with until his dying day. In London, he had fought against steel bars and surveillance, a physical prison that could be broken with courage, cunning, and luck. But here, in the capital of the very power he had served in secret, his captivity was subtler, invisible, and infinitely more binding. Moscow itself became the prison, and the KGB his constant jailers, even as they treated him like an honored guest. The question was not whether he could escape, for escape was impossible now, but whether he could live with the weight of his choices in a land where trust was rationed and freedom was an illusion. The first weeks were orchestrated like a theater production. Every step of his arrival was stage managed by the men who had facilitated his journey across borders, who had spirited him away from Western Europe and delivered him into the waiting arms of the Soviet state. They housed him in a modest apartment, furnished with more than enough to meet his needs, but far from luxurious, a signal that he was valued but not exalted, useful but not free. There were meetings with KGB handlers who spoke in low tones, congratulating him on his courage, reminding him of the damage he had inflicted on his former masters, and reassuring him that in Moscow he was among comrades. Yet even these reassurances were calculated, for Blake could sense in their eyes a constant measurement, an evaluation of whether he was truly theirs or merely a liability waiting to betray them as he had betrayed Britain. It was not applause that greeted him, but scrutiny, not celebration, but suspicion. They introduced him to the city carefully, as though unwrapping him layer by layer into Soviet life. First escorted walks through quiet neighborhoods where nobody knew his face. Then evenings in dim cafes where his presence could be explained away as just another foreigner in Moscow. Eventually, he was taken to private gatherings, introduced to other defectors who had walked a similar path, men who had once belonged to MI6, CIA, or West German intelligence, but now lived in the peculiar half-light of exile. Some greeted him warmly, seeing in his survival proof that their own choices were not in vain. Others regarded him with the same suspicion the KGB exuded, wondering if perhaps Blake's escape was too perfect, too convenient, and whether he might be yet another British plant sent to test their loyalty. This paranoia, Blake discovered, was the currency of his new world. The mechanics of espionage that had defined his career did not end with his arrival. They simply mutated into daily survival techniques of a different kind. The brush passes and microdots were gone, replaced now with the constant art of reading faces, parsing silences, and judging when a comrade's embrace was sincere or staged. The Soviet embrace itself was a kind of tradecraft, one that promised belonging while ensuring dependence. His handlers gave him a new identity for paperwork, but in truth, his name had not been erased. Among the British intelligence community, he was a ghost, but here he was, George Blake, the celebrated defector, useful for propaganda and valuable as a living example of Western betrayal. He was invited to speak privately to Soviet officers about British intelligence structures, to recall the subtleties of MI6 operations, to explain the mentality of his former colleagues. Every memory he shared bought him another measure of trust, but with each revelation, he also surrendered a piece of his past, carving away what little remained of his old self until only the Soviet-approved version remained. His new life in Moscow was marked by contradictions. The Soviets wanted him to live comfortably enough that he would not regret defecting, but not so comfortably that he would imagine himself independent. He was given a stipend, an apartment, and eventually the companionship of a Russian woman who became his wife. Yet even this domestic arrangement bore the invisible fingerprints of the state. The KGB had long understood that the strongest leash was not fear, but entanglement. A family, a home, children, these would anchor Blake to the soil of the Soviet Union more effectively than armed guards or iron bars ever could. And so, when Blake's family life blossomed in Moscow, when children's laughter began to fill the walls of his apartment, it was as much a tactic of intelligence craft as any coded message or hidden camera. Yet, beneath the veneer of belonging, he wrestled with an isolation deeper than any he had felt in Wormwood Scrubs. The Englishman in him remained, the cadences of his birth country's language still rolling through his thoughts even as Russian words took over his tongue. He received visits from Soviet officials who offered camaraderie, yet he knew none of them would ever truly regard him as one of their own. To the Soviets, he was a trophy, a weapon, and a reminder of their reach into the heart of Western intelligence. To his former countrymen, he was a traitor whose name could not be spoken without bitterness. He belonged fully to neither, trapped in the liminal space between two worlds, celebrated yet distrusted, embraced yet isolated. From time to time, the KGB paraded him quietly, not in public ceremonies, but in curated conversations with carefully chosen audiences. He was asked to explain why he had turned his back on Britain, to describe the moral failings of the West, to affirm the justice of the Soviet cause. In these moments, Blake became both actor and prisoner of his own story. He gave them the words they wanted, but he could never entirely silence the inner voice that reminded him of the path he had walked, of the comrades he had betrayed, of the secrets he had sold. Espionage had always been a world of lies, but now the lies were not whispered in back alleys or hidden in cipher pads. They were spoken aloud, in polished sentences, crafted not to deceive an enemy, but to reassure his hosts. Still, the KGB never ceased their vigilance. His telephone clicks reminded him that his life was monitored. Neighbors whose friendliness seemed rehearsed reminded him that every aspect of his existence was noted and assessed. Even his children's teachers, courteous and attentive, seemed too conveniently placed. He lived not in freedom, but in a surveillance net so finely woven that escape was unimaginable. And yet, strangely, he adapted. He learned to smile within the cage, to find rhythm in the repetition, to let the walls close in without pushing against them. The spy who had once risked everything to flee, now one understood that the real endurance lay not in running, but in surviving within a world that would never fully trust him. Over the years, as the Cold War deepened, Blake became a silent witness to the paranoia he had helped inflame. He saw the West portray him as a figure of near mythical betrayal, the man who had given away hundreds of agents and doomed countless operations. In Moscow, he saw himself used as proof that even the elite of Western intelligence could be swayed to the Soviet side. But in the quiet of his apartment, in the hours before dawn when the city's noise dimmed, he faced the truth that was never spoken in propaganda. He knew that his betrayal had cost lives, that men he had once known by name had vanished into Soviet prisons or graves because of him. And though he told himself this sacrifice was for the greater good, for peace, for the triumph of socialism, the faces of the fallen haunted him in ways the KGB could neither monitor nor control. This was the final prison, the invisible one he carried inside. Unlike Wormwood Scrubs, its walls could not be scaled. Unlike the daring escape across Europe, there was no route out. Moscow had given him a life, yes, but it had also given him a mirror he could not turn away from. Every day he looked into it and saw not just the loyal servant of the Soviet Union, but also the traitor, the exile, the man without a home. His life became a lesson in the paradox of espionage. The spy may escape capture, may outwit nations, may even reshape history, but he can never escape himself. And so George Blake stayed, year after year, becoming an old man in a city that had once seemed alien and now became the only home he had left. He lived to see the Soviet Union collapse, to witness the very system he had served dissolve into dust. Yet, even then, long after the banners had fallen and the hammer and sickle no longer flew, Moscow still held him, not by force, but by inevitability. He could not return to Britain, where his name remained cursed. He could not imagine life elsewhere, for his roots, however twisted, had sunk into Russian soil. He stayed because there was nowhere else to go, because the spy who had once run across continents now understood that some prisons cannot be escaped, only endured. The story of George Blake ends not with gunfire or capture, not with another daring escape, but with the quiet persistence of a man who chose his side and bore the weight of that choice until the end. His survival was a triumph of cunning and courage, but his life in Moscow was a reminder that espionage always exacts a price, and that no victory in the shadows is ever without its ghosts. The sound of Moscow in winter carries a strange silence, a silence that is both suffocating and endless, and as George Blake aged within the embrace of the city that had both saved him and imprisoned him, the silence grew heavier. It was not the silence of peace, nor the quiet of an ordinary life, but the echoing void left by choices that could never be reversed. His life had been an arc of daring betrayals and desperate escapes, yet as the years folded into decades, the man who once cracked codes in London, safe houses, and slipped past guards in a daring flight from Wormwood Scrubs became something else. A ghost wandering through his own legacy, watched by eyes that never blinked, held close by a system that never forgot, and haunted by a loyalty that had no true home. The KGB had long celebrated his arrival, parading him as the English traitor who had struck a blow against the very heart of Western intelligence. Yet, behind the walls of ceremony and propaganda, Blake lived under a net of control. His movements were not those of a free man, but of a valued asset fenced in by invisible chains. Every call, every walk, every meeting was measured and noted. He lived in apartments chosen for him, accepted jobs within institutions approved for him, and built relationships that were filtered through handlers who never disappeared from the edge of his world. In the first years, he told himself it was necessary, a small price for survival. But as the decades stretched on, the weight of those unseen watchers pressed deeper, and the thrill of defiance that once burned in his veins dulled into the monotony of constant surveillance. And yet, there was a paradox. Moscow rewarded him. The Soviet state gave him rank, recognition, and the material comforts denied to ordinary citizens. He received medals in private ceremonies, where hands clapped and vodka glasses rose in his honor. His deeds cast as victories of ideology against imperial enemies. He was given a dacha, a car, the ability to publish memoirs that bent truth into narrative, and the prestige of being one of the Cold War's most notorious spies. He was never poor, never desperate again. But in each reward there was a reminder. These comforts existed because he belonged to them, because his loyalty had been purchased with betrayal, because his future could never again be disentangled from theirs. In the solitude of night, when the city grew quiet and only the hum of distant trains reached his ears, he sometimes thought of Wormwood Scrubs, of the narrow cell he had once paced in ceaseless loops. He thought of the companions who had aided him in his escape, of the faces of his family left behind in England, of the children who grew up fatherless under the shadow of his absence. He thought of the men whose lives had been cut short because of his betrayals, agents exposed, networks collapsed, families shattered by executions that were triggered by the intelligence he passed into Soviet hands. These thoughts did not come with a flood of guilt, not in the way outsiders might expect. Instead, they lingered like a cold draft, an uncomfortable reminder of debts that could never be repaid. For Blake, ideology had once been the fire that justified all choices. He had been seduced by the Soviet dream, convinced that he was serving a cause greater than himself, greater even than the nation of his birth. But as the Soviet Union itself began to crumble in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when statues fell and the red banner was lowered, the question of loyalty turned into something far murkier. The empire he had thrown his life behind dissolved into dust, leaving behind oligarchs and chaos, corruption and fractured identities. Blake remained, a man who had tied himself not just to a country, but to an idea that no longer existed. His handlers aged, their ranks shifted, their emblems changed, yet the net around him remained the same. The state was different, but the cage endured. And still, Moscow treated him with a curious reverence. He became a living relic of the Cold War, a reminder of a time when battles were fought not with tanks in open fields, but with whispers, coded cables, and the silent loyalty of men willing to risk everything in the name of unseen masters. Young intelligence officers studied him as a case study, as a man who had not just betrayed his homeland, but done so with complete devotion, a model of ideological conviction. Yet even as they listened, they watched him with a subtle detachment. To them, Blake was both an honored guest and a warning. His story proved that loyalty could be captured, but it also revealed the emptiness that loyalty demanded when it was given too completely. In his old age, Blake often spoke of fate. He told interviewers that he had no regrets, that he had chosen a path and would choose it again. His voice carried conviction, but those who looked closer saw a man whose eyes betrayed a deeper truth. Regret is not always expressed in words. Sometimes it lives in pauses, in silences too long, in the way a man turns his gaze when certain questions rise. Blake could proclaim loyalty, but he could not escape the shadow of his own ghost, a ghost that followed him through Moscow's streets, whispering of England's green fields, of the Thames flowing quietly, of a life he could never reclaim. By the time he reached his 90s, Blake was more memory than man. He walked slowly, spoke sparingly, and yet his name still stirred the old arguments. Was he a traitor who deserved eternal condemnation, or a man of conviction who had acted upon his beliefs? Was he a hero to the East, or a symbol of betrayal to the West? The answer was both and neither, a truth that mirrored the paradox of espionage itself. In the end, Blake was not a simple villain or a misunderstood idealist. He was a man consumed by the machinery of loyalty, a man whose life had been defined by secrets and who could never live outside them. When death finally came in December of 2020, it arrived not with drama, but with quiet inevitability. The KGB had long since become the FSB, the Cold War had long since ended, and the empire he had served had long since dissolved. Yet, in the final announcement of his passing, Moscow honored him still, calling him a great intelligence officer, a man of remarkable courage. No Western government wept for him, and in Britain, his name remained synonymous with betrayal. He was buried not as a man with two homes, but as one with none, a figure who had burned every bridge, but still stood as a monument to the choices he made. And so, the story of George Blake does not end with triumph or tragedy, but with a ghostly persistence. He remains a question that lingers long after his death, a symbol of the thin line between conviction and betrayal, between ideology and manipulation, between loyalty and imprisonment. He lived his last decades surrounded by comfort but denied freedom, honored but never trusted, alive but never truly at peace. His ghost wanders still, carried in the archives of both East and West, studied by young officers, debated by historians, remembered by those who lost because of him, and whispered about in the long corridors where the world's spies still move in shadows. The Cold War may be over, but the story of George Blake endures as a reminder of the deepest truth about espionage, that loyalty, once given, can bind a man more completely than any chain, and that betrayal, once chosen, can haunt him longer than any prison sentence. In the end, Blake was not just a spy, he was the ghost of loyalty itself, a figure whose life was consumed by the very shadows he once sought to master. A man who died in Moscow, but lived forever in the silence of two worlds that never forgave him and never truly let him go.